Here we are back on Oppen's Heads and Tails, and in this episode, I am delighted. It's been a long time coming, but I'm delighted to welcome Will Goldsmith, Head of Bedales, to the show. Will is one of the most forward-thinking heads in the country. My words, not his. Head since September 21, having initially joined as Deputy Head Academic, previously Director of Teaching and Learning and Head of English at Latymer Upper in West London. Will is championing diversity. He's championing forward-thinking movements around assessment, and I can't wait to get stuck into some of the nitty-gritty on that today. Will, welcome to Heads and Tails.
Thanks very much for having me, Walter, and a very flattering introduction. I much appreciate that. It's always nice to have nice things said about one, so that's always good to get off on a good start.
Good. Well, let's start in a linear manner. I bored you to death with what Oppen does. We're a mentorship business. Looking back on your childhood, perhaps in your early career, did you benefit from mentorship at all?
Yeah, I mean, my education was quite varied in that I went to an international school, I went to a state primary, and then a couple of boarding schools. And so there was lots of different settings I was in. But particularly in the kind of latter two, then that kind of environment sets itself up for really good mentoring, because it's not just within a boarding context. It's not just about teachers seeing their students during the working day, but it's a much broader kind of piece. And so I had musical mentoring from my piano teacher. I had mentoring from various teachers in secondary schools, particularly those who were involved in the English department, which is what I went on to study at university. And I suppose I was also mentored, without me realizing it, by my dad, who ended up being the CFO of a very large global company. And he brought some of his understanding of leadership and probably mentoring as well home. And while I resisted it, his influence is a very strong one on me as well.
What did your dad teach you about leadership?
He taught me about making sure that I saw everyone that I was working with as equal partners in whatever endeavor we're getting on with. He taught me to connect with people on their level and on their terms rather than necessarily mine. He taught me to be self-exploratory and self-aware. And honestly self-critical in a way that certainly when you're a teenager is particularly difficult. But luckily by my mid-40s, where I am now, I've just about got the hang of it.
I'm going to jump right to the question I want to ask you, because everything you said about your father and the way he taught you, it seems to me the way you've molded your own leadership at Bedales, particular examples around the pupil-teacher relationship being such that they don't call them sir, is that right? They call them by their first names.
Yeah.
I believe you don't have uniform. What are some of the other elements around demonstrable examples of that kind of thing that you learned from your father?
Sure. I mean, just one thing to sort of put right, it's certainly not my initiative that Bedales is first name terms and students are allowed to wear their own clothes as our staff. That's something which has been pretty much in place from the onset, but bar a few kind of exceptions at various moments in the school's history. I am merely the current custodian of this particular office, and it's one which it's a provisional role in many ways, however much it's one that I'm really wedded to. In terms of kind of how things are in terms of my leadership here, then I think the big thing for me is making sure that the people around me know that I'm someone they can talk to as a human being. Obviously, I have responsibilities as a head which other people don't. And a lot of those are actually ones which are imposed on a head by external forces like the law or kind of other requirements of schools. But fundamentally within this community, then I work very hard to ensure that everyone, whether it's student, whether it's staff, whether it's parent, or broader members of our community, understand that I'm someone who, while there's only 24 hours in the day and there's only one of me, I work really, really hard to be approachable. And I suppose hats off to my very close partner in crime, Pam, who's my PA, who basically enables a lot of that to happen. So yeah, that's very much a kind of a joint endeavour, and that's really important to me.
Good. Well, let's go back a bit then. Obviously, you had a fairly formative childhood and a family who supported you in that. What was the ambition to get into teaching a little bit later on?
So initially, I did not think I wanted to be a teacher. Certainly, most adolescents don't consider that. Although there are some that I do work with who want to, which I always admire greatly. But actually, initially, when I was kind of finishing my studies at university, I thought that I wanted to apply to the Foreign Office, so the diplomatic service. And in some ways, I suppose now my job does involve elements of that particular kind of stereotype, maybe. Certainly, someone's had to be diplomatic. I do a lot of meeting of people. There's a lot of kind of speeches and sometimes kind of, engaging in quiet diplomacy as well. But initially, having lived abroad for a year as part of my degree in Spain, I took myself off to Paris, initially teaching English as a foreign language to adults, just because that was an easy way for an English graduate to get a job. So that was a kind of chance thing that I got into education, and that was about just paying the bills basically initially with the skills I could acquire quickly or that I already had. And then by chance, I sort of fell into a job working with mainly the University of California in Paris and then latterly in London, working as an administrator with study abroad programs. And so I was doing a lot of kind of informal education with American university students. So basically from graduation, I was in education, but both of my first kind of jobs were all about, it was chance that brought me there. But actually, I'm a great believer sometimes in following a more organic pathway in one's career. But actually, towards the end of my time in my job in London, then I had a boss who I really did not get on with, and it was not a happy place for me. But actually, she did me a huge favor because she really pushed me to think about what I might do otherwise. And so I started looking to education with some advice actually from people close to me at the time. And in doing so, you have to, when you're thinking about teacher training, you have to have done 2 weeks worth of observations, or you certainly did when I did my GTP. It's a kind of on-the-job teacher training program in the state sector. And the moment I went into particularly secondary schools, then there was just something about the atmosphere of secondary schools which just got me really excited in terms of the energy that young people bring to schools, and the energy of what happens in and out of the classrooms in a learning environment. And from that moment onwards, then I was hooked.
Going back to the first thing you said in a very interesting answer, do you feel it's your responsibility as a head to get more young people into the idea of going into teaching?
I mean, teaching, aside from any sort of sense of it being a noble profession, which I believe it is, there are strong kind of moral underpinnings. One certainly doesn't do it for financial gain, especially if you work in the state sector at the moment. But yeah, there are lots of kind of important things about working with future generations and empowering them and enabling them to develop. But there's just so much that's rewarding, and actually, while technology at the moment, people are saying there's kind of things which will be problematized within education, and certainly for things like assessment, especially kind of tick boxy assessment, then the machines will reduce the need for humans to do that. At the same time, I do think that there will always be a need for human beings to teach and mentor and support young people, especially, but also adults. I mean, teaching doesn't stop just when you turn 18. Learning doesn't stop, should never stop until the moment you stop living. So yeah, from my perspective, that human interaction is such a crucial part of what makes education work.
Well, let's touch on assessment then, or rather, let's go deep into assessment, particularly rethinking assessment. Bedales is famous, I'd say, for some of its original work it's doing around assessment, particularly the BAC. I'd love you to outline some of the things you're doing around assessment and perhaps give a broader discussion on where you think assessment could go.
So we've been doing our Bedales Assess courses, the BACs, for 17 years now, and they're very tried and tested. Our students, when they apply through UCAS, it's one of the sort of drop-down menu options for them to put in. So they're kind of recognised by universities on that level, and the track record of our students going on to really exciting places post Bedales speaks for itself. I think the first thing is to remind people that we've been doing it for quite a long time, and from that position for the next sort of decade, because we're just in the final stages of formulating a 10-year strategic plan, then our ambition is to increase the number of BACs that our students do and decrease further the number of GCSEs that our students do, probably down to English and maths GCSEs, because we think there is a place for 16 plus external assessment, but we think that 2 is probably enough, and ones which are more skills based rather than kind of assessment heavy or revision heavy are things which will continue to be useful in the future, both in terms of students' development, but also in terms of benchmarks for people out, in other institutions. So that's kind of very much where we want to go to, and that basically the great thing about Bedales assessed courses is they give us a lot more license to use a broader spread of assessment methods rather than just high stakes timed assessments. And there's a whole debate about accountability, and if they're external, then obviously different things come in, and we accept all of that, but we just don't think when the school leaving age is 18 in this country that you need to have high stakes assessments at 16. You probably need something to enable transfer at 16, but I think that English and maths would be sufficient. We probably need to work on our university application system as well, but I just feel very strongly, and I know I'm not the only one, Rethinking Assessment talks about this a lot, that we shouldn't have our university system dictate everything for the secondary school assessment system or the secondary school experience more broadly. We also really get excited about the possibility of tailoring our curriculum more to the needs of our students and being more agile and swift about being able to move with things which are happening in the world around us, which moves at a very high pace. The time it takes for a formal externally assessed curriculum from first development to first teaching is minimum 5 years, and that's if you want to do it well, but even then that's a tight timetable. For that to happen, if you think about something like computer science, where were we 5 years ago in computer science? Our system doesn't allow us to be sufficiently agile. It also, there's a sense in which we are very monolithic about things like English literature texts that people have to teach in GCSE. And again, that's very subjective, and it really sort of ties the hands of English teachers. If you look, for example, at the numbers of students taking up English literature A level, they've been plummeting over the last decade, and there are many people who think there's a strong correlation between what's happened with GCSEs and then that drop off in interest. So for us, it's about moving forward with languages, particularly, which are in a really parlous state in this country as well. Again, a lot because our new GCSEs, the ones that are coming in September, are even more prescriptive, even more robotic than they already are. And surely the last thing we should be teaching young people to be is robotic in this day and age. We should be teaching them to be more human and more flexible.
Agreed. Beyond the way the children are assessed, which of course we could go into much more detail, what exactly some of the perhaps more left field is a wrong word because it's not why you're doing it, but you know what I mean, what are the more original things that children are learning on the BAC?
So, the subjects that we currently teach in BACs are ones which would be largely familiar to other people, English literature, history, things like that. But we also have a global perspectives course, which some schools have kind of explored something similar, but we were one of the first schools to do that, which is a kind of multidisciplinary subject, bringing in kind of aspects of politics and economics and geography. We also teach a digital game design course where the final outcome is that students produce a digital game. And so they're learning coding, they're learning mathematical game theory, and they're learning narrative. So it's a wonderful kind of connected syllabus, but one that leads to a really concrete outcome, which again, students can really get their teeth into and really understand and is really exciting. So that's a couple of examples of ones that are a bit different.
Sorry, can I ask? It seems to me that you can't have one without the other. You can't have a forward-thinking way to assess children without a culture embedded in the society of the school that enables that to flourish. To what extent is it horse and cart? Do they come together?
There's definitely a synergy between the two, and we wouldn't have the confidence to take the kind of independent steps that we have without the legacy that we've had, not just in terms of the relationships and the kind of the way in which we connect with our students, but also just the kind of legacy of the founding principles of the school, which were to challenge the status quo, to challenge the kind of 19th century public school education model. And that kind of gives us a confidence, which sometimes I know that colleagues in other schools might not quite have, because they'll be worried about what their market might think about, or what their parental body might think. But certainly in terms of just that kind of sense of confidence in self-direction, we help our students develop that themselves. But that's something we're modeling in how we organize our curriculum, and how we talk about ourselves, to the outside world as well. So that's something which permeates every level of what we do. But you'll also find that in the huge amount of time we spend on student democracy, the amount of time we spend just talking to our students about different aspects of how our community works. And so that is something which you'll see in lots of different ways in our school.
And a bit before we go into some quick fire questions to finish, I want to just touch on something. In a previous chat, you told me that I said, well, what about the inspectorate and ISI and so on? You said, I use my independence as an independent school to challenge the status quo. So my advice, perhaps, or my question rather, is for those heads, senior leadership teams listening, keen to develop their own curricula, what advice would you have for them around how you would start?
Within the context of this, I would certainly encourage other, particularly independent school heads, to engage with exploring independence more, because we're in a time as a sector where there are certain threats that we're facing, and there's a certain amount of nervousness in the sector. I really strongly think if we're going to survive, if we're going to show people that there's a place for independent education, certainly, we have to be able to demonstrate to people that we're doing things which aren't necessarily the same as other places, that we can be more of an experimental place, we can resource things at the cutting edge, and then other sectors can benefit, whether that's the state sector in the UK, or whether that's other sectors around the world, that we have the resourcing and the confidence in what we're doing to be able to explore new things. I think if we don't, then I think we'll struggle to be relevant. So for me, that's just a really important part of kind of exercising that independence. In terms of the first steps, I think the first thing to do is always think about what's best for young people, and start from that point. And if you start from that point, then you will get to good places.
Wonderful. But that answers my first quickfire question on the state of the private sector, perhaps necessitating a drive to be independent to keep the flame bright. Perhaps then just 3 or 4 questions to finish. LGBTQ plus rights in schools and beyond. What more should we be doing?
I think for me, with this particular issue, it's obviously one that has personal resonance. There's just a great sadness that we're in the state where hate is on the rise, where ignorance and misinformation is on the rise, and even that is something which is homegrown. I think we have to be careful about what we engage with in terms of what we kind of share or kind of get drawn into, especially in terms of social media. That's a very dangerous place to be having what is a much more nuanced debate and what needs to be so. I think also people need to make it clear to kind of either people, either the media through either buying or not buying, or not going on websites or going on websites which either spread hate or spread information. So there are certain media organisations which I'm afraid are not sharing positive or accurate information, and the same thing goes for politicians as well. Engage in dialogues at every level with people who are in politics, and make it clear to them that this country is a place of tolerance and open-mindedness and inclusivity, rather than a place of hate and division. And that's a really important message, I think, for us all to think about as a society.
Very good. ChatGPT, should we embrace it? Should we fear it?
When I'm thrown binary questions, I will normally go down the middle. I think that's something we aim for in actually a lot of what we do at Bedales. People sometimes think we're kind of one end of the spectrum, but actually we aim for balance. And in this case, I would again aim for balance. I wouldn't embrace it wholeheartedly, but I wouldn't reject it wholeheartedly. I think we need to approach it carefully, thoughtfully, see where it can be useful, because it definitely has uses. It can definitely be liberating in some ways, but also be aware of the things which might be unintended consequences, or things which might kind of develop further down the line, which could be negative. And there are definitely things that we have to be aware of there.
Wonderful. Perhaps the less binary, but question to finish. We interview lots of students. Interviewing a character, something which we do. You will have interviewed lots of children before. What is the one quality that you're looking for in an interview with a child?
So yeah, we do a lot of interviewing, we do a lot of talking, and our process is probably one of the most complex and detailed admissions processes of any school. It's a 3-day residential process. For us, the biggest thing we're looking for is the ability of a young person to connect with us as a fellow human being.
Wonderful. Well, that is a message of real positivity to finish on for parents who are listening. Well, thank you so much for your time in a busy day. Many nuggets to take and advice to heed. So wonderful to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Walter. See you soon.